this has certainly been a long time coming. Ever since I started making these videos on the YouTube, the Chaos Engine has always been at or near the top of the games that I've so desperately wanted to cover. Since then, the channel's switched focus a fair few times, gradually branching out from the Mega Drive, occasionally flirting with modernity, becoming almost exclusively UO computer-based, spending months drowning in licensed games, and now it's a weird mix of classic retro and modern indie. And the engine in that time has always been firmly switched off. There'd always be, another time. But now, you know what? I reckon it's come. And I'm sure some of you wanted it anyway, and never let it be said that I don't give the people what they want. So let us delve into the 20-year history of one of the Amiga's foremost titles, a game that quite simply couldn't have come from anywhere else. Well, that sums up the first year of that 20-year history anyway. The other 19 are, well, a little bit patchy, but we shall delve into that as time comes. The Chaos Engine was made by the Bitmap brothers, a name that anyone on the Amiga scene will be familiar with. They made games that defined the system and set them apart from anything else. I've already covered the Speedball games with their shoulder barges and loop-de-loops and ice creams, blistering stuff. Speedball 2 in particular is one of the best sports games ever made. But that was hardly everything. The Bitmaps also made the Xenon series of games, much-loved UO shooters at the time, the fantastic action platformer Gods, and the more light-hearted but still very great Magic Pockets. Bitmap games though were mostly easy to recognise. They were dark, intense, heavy on the sci-fi influence, and filled with pumping electronic music, in some cases years before Streets of Rage was even a thing. They were also graphically brilliant. Games like Xenon and Gods set the standard for the Amiga back in the day. As such, they may not have held up too well now, depending on how well you can take European games from that particular age. But holding up's never been much of a problem for the Chaos Engine. The Chaos Engine would basically take all of the Bitmap's signature touches and influences and crank them all the way up to 11. It would be the first game that they designed specifically for the Amiga 1200, with all the graphical improvements that entailed. The dark sci-fi touches? Oh well, they'd still be there. In fact, the game was going to be steampunk. It'd be an intense, lasting experience for 1 or 2 players, and the soundtrack? Oh well, you hadn't heard nothing yet. The Chaos Engine was basically the Bitmap's baby, a title they'd always wanted to make. And so it took quite a long time. Although they were once fairly prolific, a whole 2 years passed between 1991's Magic Pockets and the release of the Chaos Engine in 1993. But hoo boy was it worth waiting for. The scores? Speak for themselves, as do the sales and the reputation of being one of the greatest games ever to come out on the system. Of course, not that any of this matters, because, at the end of the day, let's be honest, my opinion is the only one that matters. I mean, if I don't like the game, then you may as well just go into telesales or something, Anyway, the point I'm trying to get across by being a complete arsehole is, let's get to the damn review in earnest already. Anyway, the whole steampunk thing, let's do that. Steampunk's a pretty in thing nowadays, and has been ever since a slightly obscure 2006 release called Bioshock. The other games in this largely forgotten and unheralded series have also embraced the aesthetic, as have other modern games such as Dishonored, Torchlight, and the Thief series. But there's been plenty of other steampunk games. It's hard to find a time where steampunk hasn't influenced games somewhat. The only difference seems to be that in the 90s it was largely the Japanese who were doing it. A lot of famous RPGs, especially Final Fantasy VI and VII, bear heavy steampunk influences, as do platformers like Rocket Knight Adventures. That's not to say the West weren't doing it as well. Remember Myst? There's a lot of steampunk in gaming, which isn't all that hugely surprising, because although the methods have been around for quite a long time, the actual term steampunk has only really been around since the late 1980s, defining works that took great influence from the likes of, say, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, or Fritz Lang's Metropolis, or later works such as The Wild Wild West or Terry Gilliam's Brazil. So the influence of steampunk in gaming has been around almost as long as the term itself, which in the grand scheme of things isn't all that long, so they dovetail quite nicely with each other. But the Chaos Engine is certainly one of the loudest examples around. More than taking elements from steampunk, it's a full-on steampunk game, inspired in part by a steampunk book, The Difference Engine by William Gibson and Bruce Sterling, taken from that engine concept. sort of like a steam-powered artificial intelligence, and the broad character archetypes you can play as. The characters are quite fun actually. They're similar to the traditional Gauntlet style of simply naming the players Warrior, Valkyrie or Wizard, only with a little bit more colour. You have a variety of heavies, speedies and all-roundies, with names like Brigand, Navvy, Thug or Preacher, and supremely detailed portraits to boot. The Thug is sadistic beyond belief. He's like the damned hellspawn of Dickens's Magwitch. The Preacher reminds me of the moment when Gandhi discovers democracy in civilization. He looks oh so sedate and peaceful, but you peer into his eyes and nuclear fire stares right back at you. And then there's my personal favourite, the Gentleman. Debonair, relaxed, ready. A big souped up flintlock and a churchwarden pipe. He's the 19th century Solid Snake. It's a fantastic motley crew, a prime example of first-rate gaming artwork that only gets better throughout the whole game. So choose your merry band, gather supplies of whale oil while ye may, and get ready. Ultimately, despite all of this wonderful dressing, and it is wonderful dressing, Chaos Engine is a top-down shooter come maze game, very similar to Gauntlet. The main goal in every level is to find and activate the nodes which will open up the exit door, all the while fighting tons of monsters, robots and various assorted eldritch abominations. Simple enough, right? But there's a wee bit more to it. First off, there's tons upon tons of secrets in damn near every level, way more than there was in something like Gauntlet. Secondly, you'll always have a partner on your journey, whether you're playing with one or two players. That can be a warning sign sometimes. Do you remember LJN's X-Men game, where the computer partner does nothing except constantly fire in random directions? Well, thankfully the Chaos Engine isn't like that. They'll actually contribute to the firefight and not just hold you up. They're not perfect, but they are serviceable. You can also do lots of levelling up between stages. It's worth killing as much as possible just so you can earn the money to make your guys even stronger, faster, smarter, give them more specials, all sorts. The game gets hard quite quickly, so you'll most definitely want all that money. There are no continues, my friend, only lives. And rather than dividing the coinage neatly between the two players, you keep everything you collect for yourself. And that can create a little bit of competition, something that's very much welcome. So yes, it's Gauntlet, only bigger and better, and packed with some of the best graphics and music the Amiga ever had. The Chaos Engine pushes an A1200 almost to its limit. There's so much detail in the sprites and backgrounds, and there's so damn much of them to boot, meaning that the game does suffer from quite a lot of slowdown, especially if you don't have any expansion. It's a quibble, but it's one you can easily live with. Honestly, the slowdown actually does help when things get frenetic, and they surely will. So yeah. The music is some serious teeth-grinding underground rave shit. It's not that far off from the almighty Streets of Rage when it comes to getting you pumped for action. And there's loads of sound effects to boot. A narrator, even some explosions, some grunts and groans and monster moans. It's one hell of a showcase for the system, as well as just being a fantastic game that never stops being playable. The Chaos Engine is one of the best Gauntlet clones around, and I would even go so far as to put it ahead of the arcade classic it was inspired by. I absolutely love the game, and I would probably put it in my own personal Amiga top 3. Not that the Amiga's the only way you can play it. The game also received console ports for both the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo. It should be noted that if you're American, you probably call this game Soldiers of Fortune. Now the main thing about these ports is that they probably run smoother than the original on a basic A1200, but the audio-visual quality is clearly diminished, however it's not too great a difference. Largely the game has come through intact. The only major difference is that the console bigwigs were a bit iffy about one of the characters being a preacher, and so he's now a scientist, no religion in games and so forth. Similarly, the gentleman's pipe has been taken away from him, because this is a no-smoking steampunk universe, don't you know? But these ports are both very good indeed if you want a Chaos Engine fix. Although it pains me to say it, the better port is clearly on the SNES. The sound's more bearable, and surprisingly the game runs smoother here. I was expecting quite a lot of slowdown, but it wasn't bad at all, better than the Mega Drive. To be honest, there's very little bad to say about the Chaos Engine in general. It's a classic, of the highest quality. It was a big hit to boot, and it should have solidified the bitmap's reputation as legends. It should have been a springboard for even greater things. Alas, the Chaos Engine would end up being their peak. It's hard to piece together exactly what happened after the Chaos Engine. The game was a big deal and sold gangbusters, but it was very expensive to make. However, things looked rosy, and there were even plans to make a sequel, which were indeed put into action. Chaos Engine 2 wouldn't just be more of the same either. It'd take the system from the old game into brand new directions, and it would make a nice send-off for the Amiga as well, not to mention also getting releases on the consoles. The game was scheduled for release in 1995, and magazines started the preview machine. And then, the delays came, thick and fast. All of a sudden, before you knew it, the game had slipped into development hell. Not too many details exist, but apparently there was something severely wrong with the engine. And more than that, there also wasn't really a lot of time. The Mega Drive and SNES were both kinda winding down by this point, and well, as for the Amiga, whew, boy, that wasn't in a good place circa 1995. And it seems as though the bitmaps had kinda run out of money in the bargain. They were also developing an RTS called Z at the same time, and ultimately there wasn't going to be enough resources to give both games the time they needed. So ultimately Z won out and was released to high acclaim in 1996, while Chaos Engine 2 was shunted down to the second division. And the upshot of this is all kinda miserable. The Chaos Engine 2 certainly never came out on consoles. A prototype exists for the Mega Drive and is shown here, but that's it. However, it did come out on the Amiga in very late 1996, by which time the system was all but dead. And this game wasn't going to revive its fortunes any. The Chaos Engine 2 takes the cooperative style of the original and switches it to head-to-head play. Now the characters are racing against each other to complete a level's objectives. It seems like a good idea, and it can actually be kinda fun. The levels are small enough so that you get to fight with your opponent a lot over who gets the circuits or whatever. Think of it as Chaos Engine meets Spy vs Spy meets Gladiators. In places, it does work, but on the whole, I wouldn't call it a good game. For a start, it looks and sounds terrible. The steampunk aesthetic of the last game is largely disposed of in favour of a very dull alien ship environment that almost seems to exist because the developers couldn't think of anything else to use. The pumping soundtrack's gone too, replaced by completely unmemorable thuds. And really, the game still feels very unfinished. It's kinda buggy, takes forever to load, there's only 4 characters this time, and the levels are very bare. You only ever get simple goals such as find all the circuits or push the batteries, and it feels like there's barely any enemies. Aside from any interactions you have with your opponent, the frantic pace of the original is just gone. It doesn't feel anything like a Chaos Engine game at all, in fact, seeing as basically everything is gone except for a handful of the characters. Alas, the game probably could have been good with more development, but something obviously just went drastically wrong here, and it couldn't quite be recovered. Chaos Engine 2 was reviewed favourably, however, by the handful of Amiga mags left around this time, but then that's not all that surprising. This is one of the last big games released for the machine, and by this point the magazines would just pounce on anything big they could get. The few fans left, however, were disappointed, and rightly so. This isn't an awful game, but it's a very poor sequel to a great game. And so, the story ends there, right? The bitmaps kind of fade away as the generations pass. They barely did anything in the 32-bit era aside from an awful 3D update of Speedball, and in recent times there's been virtually nothing aside from the occasional makeover of their older games, very few of which make any impact at all. There's been nothing new, and nothing to speak of when it comes to their greatest and most intriguing title. That is until 2013, when it was announced that the Chaos Engine would be remade and released on Steam. Which I suppose shouldn't have come as too much of a surprise, because after all, remaking old European franchises is all the rage nowadays, isn't it? I mean, there's games like, Super Frog HD. You know, a remake that absolutely no one asked for, or wanted. Not to mention somewhat dispiriting Kickstarters for old games that just always seem to fail, or guys who really should just shut up and retire already. One does wonder. This isn't going to be like your 50-year-old dad going to a nightclub, is it? And you've got to intently watch him just in case someone switches up his heart pills for ecstasy. But hey, it's not all bad. Gianna Sisters was a fantastic comeback, wasn't it? And there's also the promising spectre of the big full 3D Shadow of the Beast revival. One would hope that a Chaos Engine remake would be updated quite nicely, with everything that made the original so great cranked right the hell up, past 11, past 100, right all the way up to 1000. Make it the best game ever, make it intense as hell. It's always been a brilliant co-op game, so you know, we can really kick it up a notch, ratchet up the gears and all that, you know. I'm ready, I'm pumped, let's go buy it, let's do it, let's play the Chaos Engine on PC. Well, just in case you've forgotten, this is the Amiga version. And this is the new version. Back to the Amiga version. HD again. Tell you what, why don't we stick them side by side? Maybe throw them back full screen, overlay the HD on top of the Amiga? What about if I turn one of them into a ball? No matter what I do, I'm not going to be able to tell the fucking difference. Seriously, I was looking at the gameplay vids for this, and for about 2 minutes they were showing the old Amiga game, and I was feeling quite nostalgic about it. Until I realised that they'd been showing the original game for too freaking long, and that this was actually the remake. Look, obviously the original's art style was great and all, but you couldn't do anything with it, at all. I look at this, I see that it says the game's remastered, and I see barely anything that's changed. Everything from the graphics to the controls to the music is exactly the bloody same. If anything, they're worse. I mean, the graphics certainly are. The remastering basically consists of the same awful bloom and texture smoothing filters you'd find in just about any emulator. And when you go full screen, it all gets enlarged and pixelated to crap. I mean, geez, they couldn't even be bothered to fix that. Look, don't get me wrong, the Chaos Engine is a great game. It's still a great game. If you've never ever played the Chaos Engine before and you wish to play it legitimately, then this version is as good as any. If this had been released on, say, Good Old Games, there wouldn't be all that much of a problem. But on Steam, you kind of expect a bit more. Hell, the people behind this weren't advertising it as a remaster, they were advertising it as a remake, which it clearly is not, it's just a re-release. There's nothing here you couldn't experience on frickin' WinUAE, aside from potentially playing online if you can find somebody else who had the misfortune of buying the damn thing. Mouse control, twin sticks, things that have clearly made the overhead genre a great deal better? Nope, they just don't exist. Disappointing. Insulting even. If any game from the Amiga deserves a big, proper update to bring it kicking and screaming into the modern world, it's the Chaos Engine. It'd be perfectly suited for it, way more so than, well, frickin' Super Frog. And this is all it gets. Disappointing, to say the least. And for me, unless you've never ever played it, it's not worth the money. Lazy ports like this simply aren't going to cut the mustard in 2013. As of this video, the Chaos Engine has a Metascore of 44, and frankly I think that's generous when you consider the amount of effort that clearly went into updating it. Save your money, buy something new. To be honest, I just don't really know how to end this. I mean, these days it seems like so many different old names are coming back from the grave, and not just the major ones that everybody knows. People are still really interested in the old good stuff. Geonesis has evolved from an old infamous C64 game into one of the best platformers of the modern era. XCOM was updated and reformed into a modern strategy classic. Old guys are back, and they're still relevant, and so are their games. The thing that unites all these people though is that they're not standing completely still. They're not afraid to take what they did in the past into new directions. They're not afraid to change. I mean, Jesus, do you see Brian Fargo hawking his Wasteland reboot by promising eye-splitting, captivating EGA graphics? No, you fucking don't. Even something like EA's failed reboot of Syndicate was at least an attempt at something different. If they'd have just taken the old game, slapped the word HD on it, without changing jack shit and then tried to charge money on it, people would be even more pissed than they were. So to sum up, some people are actually living in the year 2013. Others, well, they really need to raise their game. Your old games are not perfect, and they could be so much more, if only you would let them. Even if that means just giving them up and letting somebody else have a stab. In cases such as this one, well, that'd probably be for the best. Anyway, I guess this isn't exactly the most upbeat ending to a Kimble Justice video ever, but, well, there you are. In any case, it's time to close the doors on this video. So as ever, thanks for watching, and wherever you are, whoever you be, have a good one, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.